Our first question comes from Bosarge, and he asks, will the Pels have a better than average three-point shooter starting the first game of the year? My answer is yes, and I cannot imagine that Alvin Gentry will look at his roster, and a roster that seems to be putting forth Drew Holiday, Lonzo Ball, and Zion Williamson in the same starting lineup. I'm not as sure about Ingram at this point, but between those three guys, there's really just not a lot of shooting. I mean, Drew has been a better shooter earlier in his career from three. The last few years, he hasn't been great. I think that Alvin will probably at least put one guy, or know that he needs at least one guy in that lineup who can score and shoot from three. So who that is, I don't know. I don't know who that would be. But if they started Ingram too, you would have all kinds of spacing issues. And I just don't see someone like Gentry, who is typically more offensive minded, completely neglecting that fact. So who that is, I don't know. But I fully expect that they'll have at least one guy out there who can knock down shots. Our second question comes from Andy, and he asks, what do you think they'll do with that number 4 pick? Are there any serious rumblings? I fully expect that they'll trade it. And at least at this juncture, it seems to make the most sense. At some level, I think that they could probably keep that pick if they don't get any offers that they really like and wind up trading it later. But I think the most reasonable option is probably to trade it. And you can even trace that back to what Griffin was saying through Woj a very, very long time ago. If they want to create some sort of culture of sustainable winning, I just don't think that you can do that having 7 or 8 guys who are 20, 21, 22 years old. I think it's much harder to do that. I think if you really want to build a culture of winning, you have to surround your core pieces with guys who know how to win, who know how to instruct younger players. I think Drew is a perfect guy for that. And everything that I've heard from my guys at Bourbon Street Shots is that they really do not want to ship off Drew because he's just so instrumental to what they want to do. So if you ask me, it makes the most sense to trade. And who that's to, I don't know. I think the Hawks have been rumored to want to move up. There are other teams as well. And I think ultimately that's a smart move for the Pelicans, and that's at least what I hope for them to do. Our third question comes from Joe, and he asks, what kind of free agents would you target if they end up keeping the pick? It sort of follows what I was saying in the last question. I don't think it's realistic to develop a ton of young guys at the exact same time. I think they wind up getting in each other's way. And ultimately, I just want a locker room that's more balanced than that. So if they keep that pick, then you're talking about 4 very, very young guys who they have to develop. And that doesn't even include Josh Hart, who's a 5th guy. So if that's the case, then I think you got to fill the rest of those roster spots out with guys who've been around the league, guys who work hard, guys who probably won't get impatient about players not being at the level that someone who's 27 or 28 might be, because they're going to make mistakes. I mean, regardless of what you think of all of those guys as prospects, young players just make mistakes that older players aren't going to make, and that's fine. That's how they learn. So what I'd like to do is to create a culture where with someone like Drew, someone alongside 3 very, very good prospects in my mind, I think it makes sense to basically get a bunch of veterans. And 2 guys that are on my list and 2 guys that I'll probably consistently talk about are Robin Lopez and Jared Dudley. So Lopez I want just because he's a very, very hard-working guy, very intelligent, someone who's been around the league, been around multiple places, Phoenix, here, the Bulls. This is someone who at least gives you some productivity at center, someone who could probably play 15, 20 minutes a night. He's not going to win you a ton of games, but he's a guy who's going to come in, work hard, probably won't command a ridiculous contract, a guy who's been here before. I think he's awesome, and he seems like an awesome guy. And so the reason that I want Dudley is it's actually been on a podcast, and I want to say it was on the Low Post, that basically Jared Dudley was really, really important in Giannis's development, as well as other Milwaukee wings. So basically Dudley is someone who's a really good teacher, someone who is patient working with younger players. We have an elite wing in Zion. We have other elite players. I'd love for someone to sort of take their hand and guide them along the way. And if that means you paid Dudley $3 or $4 million more than what he's worth to get maximum development from the other people, I think it makes plenty of sense. Our fourth question comes from Spencer Billings, and he asks, do you think that we have a shot at signing Brook Lopez? If so, what kind of impact do you think that he'd have? I think it depends on who we get. I mean, obviously, if we get a center in the draft, or like let's just say we pretend for a second that we keep the pick and draft Jackson Hayes, or we wind up trading for someone like Miles Turner, or just any sort of center, then certainly no. I mean, I think that would be off the table. If we don't and we have a glaring hole at it, I wouldn't be shocked if we put out feelers to him, but I don't necessarily think this is the situation that he'd want to be in. I think he probably got a pretty good taste of what it's like to be on a great team in Milwaukee last year. I wouldn't be surprised if they have the cap space for him. I'm actually not familiar with Milwaukee's cap situation, but if they have the kind of cap space that they need to get Brook Lopez back, I wouldn't be surprised to get him there. If he's here, certainly I do think he would make an impact. I think Zion's not ready to be a full-time small ball center. I think that's eventually where he'll wind up being, even if it's for just 25 or 26 of the 36 minutes that he plays a night. I think it would probably help with the load that Zion would bear in his first season. I think it would help him get acclimated. And ultimately, I just think it'd be great because it'd be really nice to have a stretch big to both fill those minutes on a short-term basis, but also someone who could provide some spacing for a lineup that just doesn't have a whole lot of it. Our fifth question comes from Caleb, and he asks, could Bol be a good pick for us if he falls out of the first round? My answer is yes, but I don't think that that's going to happen. I would say that given what I've heard about Bol, despite the fact that he's someone who people have dissenting opinions on, I don't think if he's oozing that much upside, I don't think that he would fall out of the first round. My guess is that some team will take a chance on him, knowing that he could easily not pan out, but someone who, if he does pan out, could be an excellent player. I've heard some comparisons to Kristaps Porzingis. I haven't watched enough of him to really validate that, but I can tell you that my concerns, given what I've heard, would be that his motor seems to be not what you would want in a prospect. He doesn't seem all that invested. And again, this is coming from other people like our awesome draft analyst last week, Mavs Draft. So my guess, no, I don't think he'll fall out of the first round. But if this is the kind of player who would fall out of the first round, then yes, you're absolutely correct. This is a reasonable risk to take because you get him on a super cheap contract with a lot of non-guaranteed money, and you can wind up basically striking gold in a situation where most people aren't expecting to find a whole lot. Our sixth question comes from David, and he asks, who are potential free agents to add shooting? I'll list two because I think it depends obviously on who we're going to get in terms of positions. I'm not sure that Zion's ready for a full-time center load, so I do think that at some level, given the fact that we have a lot of wing shooters or wing players who aren't very good shooters, I think it would make sense to add a stretch big. I think a guy who makes some sense is Dwayne Dedmon, a guy who works really, really hard, who sort of reinvented himself and got some three-point shooting to his game, I think about 2 years ago. And I think if you're looking at a wing, I think someone like Wayne Ellington makes some sense. Wayne Ellington, since from the start, really was billed as a great shooter and has been exactly that. A guy who probably won't need 30 minutes a night or anything like that. And that's what I'm looking for. I'm not looking for perfect players to play 33, 34 minutes a night alongside these other players. I'm looking for established veterans who can come in, work hard, get decent minutes, and who can just basically teach our younger guys how to play in this league. And I think that's a reasonable thing to be asking for. I want to take a second before we get to our seventh question and talk about some rumors that actually no one asked about, but I think are really pertinent. There's some rumors that the Pelicans are wanting to trade up to get someone like RJ Barrett, and they want to trade up to the Grizzlies at 2. I don't think that's reasonable. If they are trading up to go to 2, I actually think they would probably be targeting someone like Ja Morant. I just don't think that they would trade up a bunch of assets that they just acquired to go to 2 just to draft someone who they could get at 3. If anything, I think it'd be a more direct route to go to 3 to get to RJ Barrett, and I don't think that they're trying to do that. I think the media makes a whole lot about how Zion and RJ are good friends, but I don't think that that's necessarily a good reason to draft him. I don't. I think it's a tiebreaker of sorts. If I thought RJ Barrett and someone else were of equal talent, of course I'd want, if he fits well with Zion, I'd rather someone who Zion really likes, but I don't think that you craft your team around that. And there's another rumor by, I think it was Mark Stein, saying that the Pelicans are looking, or at least listening to the Timberwolves, who are trying to move up from 11. I think that's a reasonable thing. I mean, in this draft, we had a really awesome guest last week, Mavs Draft, and he was saying this as well. There's a lot of uncertainty. So you might get someone at 11 that you would be just as good as someone at 4. And that's true of all drafts. Of course, there's always going to be people later in the draft that are going to do better than the people who are earlier. But that does not necessarily mean that you have as good of a chance. And going at 4, I mean, drafting at 4, that's your guy. You can get your guy in a way that you probably couldn't get at 11 because a lot of people are going to be off the board. But if you have multiple prospects that you think will be in that range and you really don't see a big difference between them, then sure, you can trade down and get an additional asset, someone like Robert Covington. All of a sudden you fill a wing position with a hardworking veteran, a guy who, man, Covington's been through a lot because he was there through Philly when Philly was terrible. And if you were trying to construct a team, I think it would make a lot of sense if your talent evaluation says that you can get someone at 11 that you think is on par with someone at 4. I absolutely think you make that sort of trade and trade down. Is that the best trade available? I don't know. I don't know if someone like Miles Turner's on the table. I don't know if someone like Bradley Beal's on the table. Those guys would be obviously higher on my list than someone like Robert Covington. But if that trade is available and that's your chance to go get a veteran, a guy who's in one of the best defenders in the NBA, who shoots threes well, and who's just a really hard-working player, then certainly I think that should be an option. Our 7th question comes from Bobbin. Does trading for Lonzo affect the Pelicans' game plan for signing a point guard in free agency like Malcolm Brogdon? I don't know if Brogdon was truly a target or if he is truly a target. I don't think it would be that affected by Lonzo's signing, and here's why. I think that Lonzo is someone who, because he's 6'6", I think he could slide between multiple guard spots, and I really do think, and this is going to sound crazy, but I think Lonzo could be a 3 just as easily as he could be a 2 or a 1. I think if you're looking at his offense, he's always going to resemble more of a point guard because of the way he plays. He looks to facilitate first, a guy who has a really good job, who does a really good job of keeping track of a lot of players on the floor. I think that what you need alongside him is I think you need someone who can shoot. Now, whether that's a 6'5" guy who's a point guard or if that's a 6'7" guy who's a wing, I don't think it really matters. I think you have a lot of defensive flexibility between him and Drew because they're both big enough at whatever you would consider them to slide between multiple perimeter positions. So I don't think this precludes them from going after someone like Brogdon, but I don't think that's necessarily their target. I think they would probably go for someone more like, and this is just an example, I think they would go for someone more like Robert Covington. I think they are probably looking for wings who can defend and shoot threes, and that would be my guess. Our 8th question comes from Austin, and he says, do you expect the Pelicans to play in holiday games next season, opening day, Christmas, or both? I think yes. I think that Zion and Lonzo are going to be a show, and I think the NBA will see that. I think it would be pretty cool if they wound up putting us against the Lakers on Christmas Day or something like that. I wouldn't be surprised. So we'll see what happens, but I do expect there'll be at least one high-profile game like that. Chris True wants to know, what's your wildest prediction for the first Lakers and Pelicans game in New Orleans? This is going to be hard to do. I think a fight would be the most fun. I kind of wanted to see them throw down. Given what happened last year with LeBron and his teammates, there were all kinds of funny things going on with, basically pictures of LeBron trading his players or pointing to his players like you can trade him and him to get Anthony Davis. I think there seemed to be a lot of bad blood there, and someone like Josh Hart who came in, and I don't know if this is just how he is, but he's embraced New Orleans pretty quickly, and I don't know if that's because he hated playing for the Lakers so much or being in that dysfunctional environment last year, or if he just really, truly loves New Orleans. Either way, I think I think there will probably be some pent-up animosity between the Lakers and the Pelicans, given what happened. More so probably for like Lonzo and Josh Hart than anybody else. And I'm eager to see what happens. I would love to beat them. I'd love to see the Lakers fail, and that's a little bit petty, but yeah, I think they've had it coming for some time, and they haven't really been good. So we'll see what happens. Our next question comes from Shamit Dua, another Bourbon Street Shots guy, and he asks, do you think that the Pelicans can create a top 12 to 14 offense off of transition, early offense, and good shot selection alone? If the Pels commit to that identity with their roster and really focus on defense, do you see a good regular season team despite the lack of shooting? I think they can have a good season, but I guess it depends on what you consider good. I mean, can they win 50 games doing that? I don't think so. Can they win 40 to 45 games like that? Maybe. I guess my issue would be whether they can create a disciplined defense. I think if you look at the roster they have constructed right now with Lonzo, Drew, and Zion, and again, I don't know if Ingram's starting. That's something I'm curious to see. But if you work with those guys, there's a lot of defensive flexibility there. They have a ton of, so Drew and Lonzo are both guards who can switch between a lot of positions. And I think that's unique. You don't see a lot of teams who have positions 1 through 5 able to switch, and we already have 3 guys of that nature. So if you get someone like Robert Covington, and then we even talked about this online, if we get someone like Steven Adams, that's you can create a pretty awesome defense with that. I think the issue is going to be gambling, because I think there will be a lot of that between Lonzo and Zion. I think they're going to have to dial that back a bit. I do think, though, at some level, I want to keep some of it, because I think I would create a defense that's extremely flexible and extremely chaotic. I think that they're going to generate a ton of turnovers, and I think that's going to help them get out in transition. That won't account for more than 1/5 of their offense. Most of the teams, even heavy transition teams, don't get above 21, 22%. So I think that that's only going to be a small part of our offense. But I fully expect, given that Gentry's the coach, that this is the kind of team that you do want to get out and run. And I think they're building exactly that. And I'm interested to see what it looks like, because I really don't think Gentry's had the right kind of players for a system for a long time. And I'm very interested to see what kind of defense they can create and how that will lead to better offensive possessions. Our next question comes from Elite Board, and he asks, who would your dream co-host be? It's pretty easy for me. I think someone like Ben Falk would be high on that list. I would want someone who would work in an NBA front office, because I just love learning about all of this stuff, but everything that I learn is more or less what I see from other smart people or just things that I put together myself. I would much rather just pick the brain of someone who's been in an NBA front office, someone who's seen how these things work, because I have a bazillion questions, and answering them all and putting it together myself, I think, is a lot more difficult than getting it directly from a source or multiple sources that you really trust. And so if I had to pick someone besides Nick, I love you, but it would probably be someone like Ben Falk. Our last question comes from Hell's Pels, and first, before I even answer that question or even talk about that question, that's a really cool Twitter name. Second, so his question is, if the Pelicans take a guard at 4, who would you target in free agency to fill the wing and forward spots? I go for guys who are low usage, so I'm not really looking for players to be swallowing up a lot of shots, because I just think I really want to give the shots to Lonzo, Ingram, Drew, and Zion. I think between those 4 players, I already have enough scoring to where I don't want someone that's extremely high usage coming in unless he's talented enough to justify it. And I just don't think that we're getting a big fish. I don't think we're getting someone, I mean, this is just an example because Durant's going to be hurt next year, but we're not getting a Kevin Durant. We're not getting a Jimmy Butler. I think, if anything, if you look at this team, I want someone who's an established vet, a guy who can come in, work hard, isn't going to complain about minutes or the fact that we're not necessarily trying to maximize our wins next year. So who that is, I mean, I go with someone like Jared Dudley, someone who's probably a lot better positioned in a small ball 4 spot right now, but someone who can develop our younger players by teaching them how to play the game, teach them things in the film room. I think that's the kind of player that I want. I'm not looking for someone to be the best player. I'm looking for someone who will help our younger guys to become the best players they can be. Okay, that's going to wrap it up for our questions. Thank you all so much for the questions. I really appreciate it. I wanted to hit on as many as I could. So I wanted to put one more thing on the record for tonight before I go to work. I think the Pelicans are going to trade that pick. I think if you look at the demand for it, there seem to be a lot of teams that are interested in moving up to number 4, mainly probably because of Darius Garland and his rising stock. So I think given that, and given that we already have so many young players on the roster that we really need time and minutes or time and shots to invest in, I just can't imagine that we're not going to trade that pick. I think we'll probably wind up trading it for some sort of established veteran and some sort of future draft capital, whatever that might be. So I think it makes sense. I'd love to see it, and go Pels.